Picture this, if you will. 30,000 years before Christ, when the world was a fundamentally different place, the great ice walls stretched across continents like frozen mountain ranges, and humanity clung to life in scattered pockets of survival. In one such pocket, nestled in a valley that seemed blessed by the gods themselves, lived a people who called themselves the River Bend clan. For 3 generations, these people had thrived. They had fresh water, abundant game, and shelter from the worst of the Ice Age storms. This valley would one day be called paradise by those who came after. But first, it had to survive its curse. The curse came quietly at first. The sweetest springs, the ones that had sustained the River Bend people for countless seasons, began to turn deadly. Not all at once, mind you. That would have been too obvious, too merciful in its clarity. No, this was the kind of slow-motion catastrophe that creeps up on a civilization and strangles it with invisible hands. The rot sickness, as they came to call it, followed a pattern that would have been recognizable to any modern epidemiologist. It began with morning tremors, subtle shaking that people attributed to cold or fear or the restless spirits of the dead. Then came the skin changes. Patches would appear, angry and red, before beginning to peel away like birch bark stripped from a tree. The strong hunters and gatherers, people who could track mammoth across frozen plains or gather enough berries to feed a family through winter, would waste away to skeletal figures. In the end, they begged for death. And the smell. Imagine the stench of decay hanging over an entire settlement, even in the depths of winter, when frozen ground should have stopped all rot. That's what the River Bend people lived with, day after day, season after season. Now, in any human society facing existential crisis, patterns emerge. Some people rage against the dying of the light. Others retreat into denial or despair. But there's always someone who watches, who observes, who refuses to accept that this is simply the way things must be, that someone was Grok's stone digger, while his father, the mighty hunter Thunderfist, wasted away despite every offering to the water spirits. Grok did something his brothers couldn't understand. He sat silent by the sacred pools and watched, not prayed, not raged, not performed the ritual dances. He watched, and what he saw would change everything. Grok noticed that ravens, those clever scavengers who would eat almost anything, avoided certain springs entirely. He observed how the sickness followed the rains, spreading from the lowest dwellings upward through the settlement like some invisible tide. While others painted their faces with sacred mud and danced to appease the angry ancestors, Grok traced water's path with an obsession that bordered on madness. You have to understand, this was heretical thinking. In a world where survival depended on following the wisdom of elders, where tradition literally meant the difference between life and death, questioning the sacred springs was tantamount to questioning existence itself. But Grok had something his more prominent brothers didn't have. Ironically, it was his low status that gave him freedom. As a man who played with rocks while real men hunted, he was already considered something of an oddity. His thoughts weren't considered dangerous because his thoughts weren't considered important. The clan's response to the crisis followed ancient patterns that would be familiar to anyone who studied how societies react to incomprehensible threats. Increase the sacrifices to the gods, relocate the sick to mercy huts downwind from the healthy, paint more symbols on the sacred stones, perform the dances with greater fervor, do everything possible except question why the blessed springs might carry curse instead of cure. But Grok's mind worked differently. While others sought supernatural explanations, he looked for patterns in the natural world. His first experiment came at a terrible cost that nearly broke his spirit entirely. Working in secret, using tools meant for other purposes, he dug a small channel to redirect overflow from one of the contaminated springs. Just a tiny diversion, barely noticeable to anyone not looking for it. The water from this spring had been flowing near the dwelling of his sister and her family. His infant nephew, barely old enough to crawl, had been showing the early signs of the rot sickness. When that child became the season's first survivor in memory, Grok knew he had discovered something profound. But knowledge without power meant nothing. In a world where challenging tradition could mean death, the weight of that knowledge must have been crushing. Here was a man who had possibly found the key to saving his people, but revealing it meant risking execution for blasphemy. Every day he delayed, more people died. He waited, the evidence mounted. But every day he also watched others who dared question the old ways face the wrath of the shamans and the mob. Think about that pressure for a moment. Imagine knowing you might hold the solution to a plague that's destroying your entire civilization, but revealing that knowledge could get you killed before you could implement it. How do you sleep at night? How do you look into the eyes of the dying and not scream the truth? Grok Stone Digger was about to face the most crucial decision in his people's history, and what he chose to do next would determine whether the Riverbend clan would join the countless tribes that simply vanished into the ice and darkness, or become the first people to win a victory over nature through observation, experimentation, and courage. The revolution was about to begin, carved not in stone or metal, but in mud and moving water. Knowledge without power meant nothing in a world where tradition equaled survival. And Grok, Stone Digger, sitting by his dying father's bedside, understood this terrible truth with crystal clarity. He had discovered something that could save his people, but revealing it might get him killed before he could prove it worked. So he made a choice that would define not just his own fate, but the trajectory of human civilization itself. He chose the middle path. He chose guerrilla engineering. Picture Grok working by moonlight, using the darkness as his cover while his clan slept fitfully around their dying fires. The tools he used tell us everything about the desperate ingenuity of this moment. Flint knives meant for butchering mammoth became earth-cutting implements. Mammoth shoulder blades, normally used to scrape hides, transformed into primitive shovels. Hollow reeds that children used as drinking straws became precision instruments for guiding water flow. Night after night, he extended his channels. Each small diversion was carefully calculated, designed to look like natural erosion to casual observers while secretly redirecting the poisoned water away from the living areas. He was performing surgery on the landscape itself, operating without anesthesia, on a patient that couldn't consent to the procedure. But you can't keep secrets forever in a tight-knit community of survival, and the person who discovered Grok's midnight activities was perhaps the worst possible choice for his continued health and well-being, Brak, Mammoth Slayer. Even the name tells you everything you need to know. This was a man who had earned his reputation by taking down the largest prey animals on the continent. A traditionalist who saw any deviation from ancestral wisdom as a personal insult to his own authority. When Brak stumbled across Grok's channel system during an early morning hunt, his reaction was swift and predictable. Defilement of sacred grounds. Brak's voice carried across the settlement like the roar of an angry bear. This rock player has poisoned our rare water spirits with his cursed ditches. The confrontation that followed reveals so much about how human societies handle revolutionary ideas. The clan elders, faced with something they couldn't understand, defaulted to the most ancient form of conflict resolution, trial by combat. 3 champions against 1 accused blasphemer. Now, if you were placing bets on this fight, you wouldn't have given Grok much chance. A man who spent his time digging in the dirt against 3 professional warriors? The outcome seemed predetermined, but Grok had something his opponents didn't expect. He understood the ground they were fighting on, the fighting pit, carved into the earth generations earlier for just such trials, had always been considered neutral territory. But Grok saw it differently. He saw drainage patterns, soil composition, and the effects of the morning dew. When the combat began, Grok didn't try to match his opponent's strength. Instead, he used his knowledge of water flow to turn the pit into a muddy trap. Watch how this unfolds. As the champions charged, confident in their superior size and skill, Grok deliberately broke open a small water channel he had noticed, feeding into the pit's lowest corner. The resulting mud didn't just make footing treacherous. It created a quagmire that trapped the heavy frames of his opponents while Grok, lighter and more agile, danced around the edges. He still got beaten bloody, make no mistake about that. But he survived long enough for something unprecedented to happen. Elder Mother Maya, the clan's most respected woman, and ironically one of those dying from the rot sickness, demanded that the trial stop. She wanted to hear what this crazy rock digger had to say. What happened next was perhaps the first scientific demonstration in human history. With the entire clan watching, Grok showed them something that challenged everything they thought they knew about their world. He revealed that stagnant water bred invisible demons. He demonstrated how moving water carried those demons away. Most importantly, he produced his map. Think about this for a moment. This was 30,000 years before the invention of writing as we know it. But Grok had created a visual representation of knowledge, marks scratched on strips of bark that showed every water source, every cluster of sickness, every pattern of survival. He had invented data visualization using nothing but observation and scratches on tree bark. The demonstration was brilliant in its simplicity. Using a shallow depression filled with water, Grok showed how debris and scum accumulated in still pools but washed away when the water moved. He explained how the sickness followed these patterns, clustering around stagnant sources and avoiding areas where water flowed freely. But knowing something and acting on it are two very different things. The clan faced a terrible gamble. If Grok was right, his methods could save them. If he was wrong, they might anger the water spirits even further and doom themselves entirely. Grok understood the stakes. In a move that demonstrated either supreme confidence or complete desperation, he wagered his family's entire winter food share on a single proposition. He claimed that proper drainage would stop new deaths within one turning of the moon. 30 days to prove that everything their ancestors had believed about water spirits was wrong. The next 7 days and nights became the stuff of legend. Grok worked like a man possessed, digging the main channel that would serve as the backbone of his drainage system. His hands bled. His back felt like it might snap. Half the clan mocked him as he worked, calling him the fool who would starve his family for a handful of mud. The other half prayed, caught between hope and terror at what they were witnessing. But something else was happening during those 7 days, something that would prove even more important than the drainage system itself. A few of the younger clan members, the ones who had watched Grok's midnight work with curiosity rather than fear, began to help. They brought him water when his throat was too dry to swallow. They spelled him for brief periods when exhaustion threatened to overcome him entirely. And most importantly, they began to understand what he was doing. They learned to see water not as a mysterious force controlled by capricious spirits, but as something that followed predictable patterns, something that could be directed, controlled, and made to serve human needs rather than human fears. The revolution had begun, not with violence or grand speeches, but with a man, some simple tools, and the radical idea that nature could be understood rather than simply endured. The question now was whether that revolution would succeed or die with its creator in the frozen mud of a doomed settlement. The answer would come with the next full moon. Sometimes the most profound revolutions announce themselves, not with thunder and lightning, but with silence. The absence of something terrible becomes more powerful than the presence of something wonderful. And that's exactly how the miracle arrived at the Riverbend settlement. It came with the absence of new deaths. Picture the morning when the clan elders gathered to count the night's victims, as they had done every day for 3 generations. They moved from dwelling to dwelling, expecting to find the familiar signs of the rot sickness claiming fresh victims. Instead, they found something unprecedented. Children who had been marked for abandonment, consigned to the mercy huts to die with dignity, were sitting up and keeping down food. Warriors who hadn't possessed the strength to lift their own heads were managing to sit upright. But here's the thing about revolutionary change. It rarely sweeps through societies like wildfire. More often, it seeps in like water through stone, slow and steady and utterly irresistible. The acceptance of Grok's methods came slowly, fought every step of the way by those who had invested their entire identity in the old ways. The shaman Vorak led the resistance, and you have to understand his position. This was a man whose entire authority rested on his ability to communicate with the water spirits. If Grok was right, If the sickness could be stopped by simple engineering rather than complex rituals, then what did that make Vorak? What did that make the generations of shamans who had come before him? So Vorak fought back with the weapons available to him. He claimed that Grok had merely delayed the spirit's wrath, not defeated it. The real punishment, he warned, was yet to come. The spirits were simply gathering their strength for a more terrible revenge. Any day now, the earth would open up and swallow the entire settlement for their blasphemy. And for a while, this counter-narrative held sway. People are comfortable with suffering they understand, even if that suffering is terrible. The unknown, even when it promises relief, can be more terrifying than familiar pain. But then something happened that changed everything. The neighboring clans began to notice. Word travels fast in a world where survival depends on knowing what's happening beyond your own territory. The Stone Axe people, the Wolf Valley clan, and the Mountain Shadow tribe all had scouts who made regular visits to trade goods and share information. When these scouts returned with reports that the Riverbend people had somehow stopped the rot sickness, the reaction was immediate and desperate. Delegations arrived at the settlement begging for the water magic. Think about what this meant. Proud tribal leaders, men and women who had never shown weakness to outsiders, were literally pleading for help. The Stone Axe chief arrived with his dying son in his arms. The Wolf Valley matriarch brought offerings of rare amber and carved ivory. They had heard rumors of a man who could make the poison springs clean again. This external validation did what internal proof never could. When other clans treated Grok's knowledge as precious wisdom rather than dangerous heresy, the Riverbend people began to see their rock digger through different eyes. Success has a way of rewriting history, and suddenly Grok's low status became evidence of his humility rather than his unworthiness. But here's where the story becomes really fascinating. Grok understood something that many innovators throughout history have missed. Having a breakthrough is one thing, sharing it effectively is something else entirely. The knowledge transfer that followed became its own revolution. Grok developed what we might recognize today as the first systematic engineering education program. He created categories of expertise: scouts who could read the land's natural drainage patterns, diggers who understood angles and water flow, and most importantly, teachers who could transform practical knowledge into memorable stories and songs. Water seeks its level, like herds seek grazing. This became the first engineering principle passed down through oral tradition. Think about the brilliance of that comparison. These people understood herd behavior intimately. By connecting water flow to something they already knew, Grok made complex hydraulic concepts accessible to minds that had never encountered formal education. The payment system that emerged tells us everything about how valuable this knowledge had become. Visiting clans brought obsidian blades from distant volcanoes, cured hides prepared with secret techniques, and jade ornaments carved by master craftsmen. But the most valuable currency became information itself: observations about what drainage techniques worked in different soils, reports of failures and successes from other territories, innovations that built upon Grok's basic principles. The first great assembly happened at the summer solstice, when 7 clans gathered at the Kumvela traditional meeting grounds. But this wasn't a typical intertribal gathering focused on trade agreements or marriage negotiations. This was something entirely new, a conference dedicated to sharing technical knowledge. Grok, now known throughout the region as Lifebringer, had prepared for this moment. Using clay and water, he built a miniature landscape that demonstrated his principles on a scale everyone could understand. Hills and valleys, springs and streams, all recreated in miniature so that clan leaders could see how water behaved under different conditions. But the real revolution wasn't Grok's demonstration. It was what his students revealed. During the months since the initial success, the people who had learned Grok's methods hadn't just copied them, they had improved them: stone-lined channels that lasted through the harshest winters, settling pools that cleaned water even further by allowing dirt and debris to sink to the bottom, networks of channels that connected family shelters, creating the first neighborhood-scale infrastructure projects in human history. Watch how this transforms society. Within 5 seasons, Ditchkeeper evolved from a desperate experiment to an honored position. Children began playing games that involved tracing water paths in sand, unconsciously learning engineering principles before they could walk properly. Young people competed to become apprentices to the master drainage builders, the way they had once competed to join hunting parties. The social changes rippled outward in ways that nobody could have predicted. Families began planning their settlements around optimal water flow rather than just proximity to game trails. The concept of permanent improvement to the landscape took hold. For the first time in human history, people were actively making their environment better rather than simply adapting to whatever nature provided. But perhaps most importantly, a new way of thinking about problems had taken root. Instead of accepting suffering as the will of incomprehensible spirits, people began to believe that observation, experimentation, and careful thought could lead to solutions. The scientific method was being born, even though it would be tens of thousands of years before anyone gave it that name. The transformation was accelerating, spreading from clan to clan like ripples across a still pond. But this was just the beginning. The real test would come when these revolutionary ideas encountered the wider world, when small-scale success had to prove it could work across vast distances and diverse landscapes. That test was coming sooner than anyone expected. The transformation from survival technique to civilization's foundation happened gradually, then suddenly. Like so many revolutionary changes throughout history, the shift seemed to occur all at once, but only after decades of invisible preparation had laid the groundwork for dramatic change. Consider the Wolf Valley people. When they first encountered Grok's drainage methods, they were a struggling band of 30 souls, constantly on the move, never able to establish permanent settlements because reliable water sources proved so elusive. Within 2 generations of adopting and refining these techniques, they had grown to 300 people living in the first truly permanent settlement anyone in the region had ever seen. But here's what makes this story so compelling. Success attracted attention, and attention brought both opportunity and conflict in equal measure. The Wolf Valley settlement became a magnet for traders from vast distances. People would travel for weeks to reach this place where clean water flowed reliably year-round, where the drainage systems doubled as gathering places during dry seasons, where innovation had created abundance from scarcity. The first market squares in human history were built around central drainage systems that served multiple purposes simultaneously. Picture these: early markets, stone-lined channels carrying fresh water through the center of the trading area, providing drinking water for travelers and their animals, while creating natural boundaries that organized the space. During the dry months, when the channels ran lower, they became amphitheaters where people gathered to share news, settle disputes, and celebrate seasonal festivals, form following function in ways that would influence urban planning for millennia to come. But success also bred new forms of conflict. When you can create reliable water sources, those sources become valuable in ways that nomadic peoples never had to consider. The first water wars began when upstream clans realized they could gain leverage over downstream settlements by controlling or diverting the flow. This led to something unprecedented in human history. The first intertribal councils focused not on warfare or marriage alliances, but on resource sharing. Imagine clan leaders sitting around fires, arguing not about hunting territories or blood feuds, but about flow rates and seasonal allocation of water rights. The vocabulary of civilization was being written in real time. The spiritual evolution proved equally profound. For countless generations, water spirits had been seen as capricious demons who needed to be appeased through sacrifice and ritual. But Grok's success had demonstrated that these same spirits could become partners in a great dance of cooperation. The transformation in religious thinking was revolutionary. Instead of fearing the spirits, people began honoring them through maintenance and improvement of the water systems. New ceremonies emerged around the seasonal cleaning of channels. Festivals celebrated the first flow of spring water through newly constructed drainage networks. Children learned songs that encoded engineering principles, turning technical knowledge into cultural tradition that would survive even if the specific techniques were temporarily lost. But the innovation's true power revealed itself in the cascading improvements that nobody had anticipated. Reliable water management eliminated food spoilage, the constant threat that had limited population growth for millennia. When you can store food without rot, you can support larger communities. When you can support larger communities, you can afford to have people who specialize in tasks other than basic survival. For the first time in human history, surplus labor became available for experimentation. Potters could perfect their techniques because they didn't have to spend every waking moment hunting or gathering. Toolmakers could develop better implements because reliable communities provided steady demand for their products. And most importantly, some people could dedicate themselves entirely to the planning and improvement of settlements. These specialists, the world's first urban planners, began to see patterns that individual families never could. They understood how drainage networks affected not just water quality, but also defense, trade, and social organization. Settlements began to be designed rather than simply assembled, planned rather than allowed to grow organically. Grok's descendants, inheriting both his techniques and his innovative spirit, developed the first technical writing system. They created symbols to mark different types of drainage solutions, ways to record what worked and what failed, methods for transmitting complex information across distances and generations. Knowledge became portable in ways it had never been before. The spread of these ideas across continents tells us everything about the power of practical innovation. Each culture that encountered drainage engineering adapted the core principles to local conditions in ways that revealed the flexibility and universality of the underlying concepts. Mountain peoples created stepped channel systems that controlled erosion while directing snowmelt to valley settlements. Desert dwellers, working with minimal water resources, developed underground networks that preserved every precious drop while protecting it from evaporation. River peoples learned to work with seasonal floods rather than against them, creating controlled floodplains that enriched soil while preventing destructive overflow. By the time Grok's great-grandchildren carved his story into the sacred stones of memory, drainage science had spread across 3 continents. But more than that, the entire approach to problem-solving had been revolutionized. People had learned that the greatest challenges could be overcome not through brute force or magical thinking, but through careful observation, systematic experimentation, and the patient accumulation of knowledge. Think about what this means. The boy who played with rocks while others hunted had given humanity its first victory over nature through cooperation rather than domination. He had proven that the greatest innovations often come from those who see what others overlook, who question what others accept, who persist when others give up. But perhaps most importantly, Grok's stone digger had demonstrated something that would become the foundation of all human progress. The idea that suffering is not inevitable, that problems have solutions, that the application of human intelligence to the challenges of existence can create a better world for everyone. Standing in that valley 30,000 years ago, watching clean water flow through channels carved by human hands, the Riverbend people could never have imagined the cities that would rise, the civilizations that would flourish, the technologies that would emerge from the simple principle that water can be directed rather than merely endured. They were witnessing the birth of engineering, the dawn of urban planning, the first stirrings of scientific method. They were seeing humanity take its first deliberate step from survival to civilization, and it all began with one man who refused to accept that poisoned water was simply the will of the gods, who dared to believe that human intelligence could find a better way, who had the courage to act on that belief even when it might have cost him everything. That is the power of innovation. That is the legacy of those who choose to dig deeper, to question further, to never accept that suffering is simply the way things must be. The channels that Grok carved in the earth are long gone, filled in by millennia of sediment and change. But the channels he carved in human thinking, the pathways of innovation and problem-solving that he opened, those flow still. They flow through every aqueduct, every sewer system, every bit of infrastructure that makes modern life possible. They flow through every moment when someone looks at an impossible problem and dares to believe that there might be a solution, if only they're willing to dig deep enough to find it.